Let's talk about how we read ancient religious texts. When you get right down to it, there are two fundamentally different ways people approach these texts. One way sees them as a perfect, flawless rulebook. The other sees them as a library, a collection of ancient human documents written for a very specific time and place. Here you can really see that tension laid out. On one side, you've got biblical literalism, which treats every single word as if it's scientifically and historically factual, period. But on the other side, you have historical scholarship. This approach uses tools like literary analysis and archaeology to figure out what the ancient authors were actually trying to say to their audience in their world. One demands certainty, the other, it invites curiosity. So what's the big deal? What actually happens when we demand that kind of absolute, literal certainty from these ancient writings? Scholars and mental health experts have been documenting a pretty significant downside, one that can create some really intense internal conflict and even psychological harm. So first things first, let's be really clear about what we mean by biblical literalism. This isn't actually how most people read these texts throughout history. It's a pretty modern invention, really popping up in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it's an approach that insists on reading ancient poetry, mythology, and law as if it were a modern science textbook. And this is where things get really stressful for the brain. I mean, think about it. If your belief system tells you the Earth is 6,000 years old, but literally all of empirical reality, geology, biology, astronomy tells you something different, your mind is stuck in a state of what's called cognitive dissonance. It's this constant, exhausting mental strain of trying to hold two completely contradictory ideas at the same time. For some people, that strain can become truly debilitating. A psychologist, Dr. Marlene Winell, actually identified this pattern of symptoms and gave it a name, religious trauma syndrome. It describes the very real psychological damage that can come from being in these high-control, fear-based religious environments, where just questioning reality is seen as a moral failing. So you can see how this all connects, right? When a belief system is built on a foundation of fear, fear of hell, fear of punishment, even just fear of asking the wrong questions, it can lead to some serious mental health challenges. It can create chronic anxiety and a deep sense of shame. And what's really crucial here is that it also trains people to shut down their own critical thinking skills. And that, well, that can make a person vulnerable to all kinds of information, not just in religion, but in every part of their life. So if that's the problem, what's the solution? The good news is we have a really powerful set of tools for understanding these texts in a way that is not only intellectually honest, but also a whole lot psychologically healthier. Historians and biblical scholars, they really do approach these texts like detectives cracking a case. They analyze the original languages to find an author's unique fingerprints. They place the text in its original ancient world, not our modern one. They ask, what genre is this? Because, you don't read a poem the same way you read a legal document. And they compare these stories to the myths and legends of neighboring cultures, like ancient Babylon or Egypt. Take the creation story in Genesis 1. A literal reading sees it as a scientific play-by-play of how the universe was made. But scholars like Dr. John Walton show that it's actually an ancient temple cosmology. It's not trying to answer our modern question of how the universe was materially made, but their ancient theological question of why it exists and what its purpose is. It's using concepts that would have been familiar to its original audience, from Mesopotamian myths, to make a brand new point about God. We can also watch how stories actually grow and change over time. The resurrection accounts are a fascinating example. Our earliest source, the Apostle Paul, he just talks about visionary appearances. Then you get the first gospel, Mark, which in its earliest form just ends with an empty tomb. That's it. It's only in the later Gospels, Luke and John, that you start to get these very physical, concrete details, like touching wounds and eating fish. You can literally see the story evolving from a more spiritual idea to a much more physical one. And this is where it gets really interesting. This detective work reveals that the Bible isn't one single book. It's a library, with different authors writing at different times. Take the letters of Paul. Scholars are pretty certain that he wrote 7 of them. But by analyzing the vocabulary, the theology, and the writing style, they can tell that other letters attributed to him were actually written by later followers. The pastoral letters, like Timothy and Titus, for example, they just reflect a more organized church structure that simply didn't exist yet in Paul's lifetime. So why does any of this matter? Why should we care about different authors or ancient cosmology? What does that have to do with our well-being today? Well, everything. This is where scholarship stops being academic and starts being a powerful tool for finding freedom from fear. This is a huge one, right? One of the biggest sources of that cognitive dissonance we talked about is this idea that you have to choose. It's either faith or science. If you believe Genesis 1 is a literal scientific account, then you are forced to reject huge parts of geology, biology, and astronomy just to keep your faith intact. But understanding the historical context solves this problem completely. The biblical authors weren't trying to contradict 21st century science. They were just using the science of their day. They believed in a flat earth covered by a solid dome with water on top. And once you realize they were never trying to write a science textbook in the first place, the conflict just evaporates. Faith is freed from a burden it was never meant to carry. Let's talk about another major source of anxiety, especially in certain American Christian circles: the idea of the rapture, of people suddenly vanishing into thin air, leaving their families behind. This idea has absolutely terrified millions of people, and it's almost always presented as a core, ancient, biblical truth. But it's not. Historians can trace this specific doctrine not to the ancient world, but to the 1830s, basically invented by a guy named John Nelson Darby. Just knowing that one historical fact can instantly deactivate a massive source of spiritual fear. It's not an ancient prophecy, it's a modern invention. At the end of the day, what this is all really about is empowerment. It's about having the knowledge to move from a rigid, brittle framework that shatters the moment it touches reality to a much more flexible, resilient, and personally authentic way of engaging with your own story. And when you make that shift, look what happens. The fear of asking questions gets replaced by curiosity. That rigid black and white thinking gives way to nuance and flexibility. Judgment can be replaced by compassion. Shame over having doubts can be replaced by an authentic spirituality that actually works with the world as we know it, instead of fighting against it. If there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this: historical understanding doesn't have to be a threat to faith. For so many people, it's a lifeline. Scholarship doesn't destroy faith. It actually rescues it from the distortions that can make it so harmful. It allows faith to become a source of wisdom and connection, instead of a source of fear, anxiety, and trauma. And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. In this age of so much misinformation, maybe one of the most powerful and healthy spiritual acts we can do is just seek understanding. What if learning where these stories and ideas actually came from is the very key that can set us free today?